Good morning, excellencies, distinguished guests. A very good morning to you all. My name is Elizabeth Cousins. I'm the President and CEO of the United Nations Foundation, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all here this morning to the UN Foundation for a discussion on enhancing the role of MDBs in catalyzing private finance and investment. We're really pleased to be co-hosting this event with the Global Investors for Sustainable Development Alliance, UN's Department of Economic and Social Affairs, and Swedish International Development Cooperation Agency, wonderful co-hosts and partners. By now, I think it's clear to everyone that the intersecting global crises we face have set development back decades in just a few years, which urgently needs to be reversed. At the same time, we all have ambitions, not just to hold ground, but to gain ground. That's what the SDGs are all about. It's what just economic transition is all about, and it's what every citizen in all of our countries deserves. That, of course, takes resources more than we've ever mustered before. We know how much the spending needs are for the SDGs. They were significant before, they're even greater now. And we know the cost of failing to act on some of the greatest crises before us. And of course, global development finance is still insufficient, which is why we need a much greater ambition in unlocking all flows and all sources, domestic and international, public and private. Some of you will have heard a recent interview of Ajay Banga, who said, we need every shoulder to the wheel and we have no time to waste. The recently published Financing for Sustainable Development report speaks to precisely this issue, including the important opportunity for multilateral development banks and development financial institutions to work in very different ways to mobilize more private finance. The GISD Alliance itself has developed a set of specific recommendations for development banks and for the global development community to mobilize capital in new ways and at new scale. And we're excited to be discussing those recommendations today. So again, a very, very warm welcome to you all. This is an extraordinary group as I look around the room. And I'm delighted to turn the floor now to two extraordinary leaders to help us set the stage with their framing remarks. So Ms. Amina Mohammed, Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations, and Ms. Diana Janse, State Secretary for International Development Cooperation and Trade from Sweden. So Deputy Secretary General, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and good morning to you all, distinguished guests. Really pleased to be participating at what is really a timely event. We've had some great discussions here in Washington over the last 3 days, and many of you have been at them. And I think all we're doing is we're consolidating that momentum to get us to what I would hope is a successful General Assembly SDG stocktake 7 years later. Where are we on the SDGs? And we will see later in the year the stocktake for Paris. So all really important. And thank you to the UN Foundation, but thank you also to CEDA for making this opportunity and space for us to have this discussion. The GISD Alliance has started from an idea that we really needed to bring in what the private sector brought to shaping the ambition of the SDGs and working with them with the very best. And so very thankful to our co-chairs of the GISD, and in particular, Jose Vinas, who has been at this meeting from the beginning, but also to my sister in South Africa. We all know that the world is facing a number of crises. We have talked about it exacerbating any of the important gains that we have sought to make, promises to keep. And it's mostly been the socioeconomic impact, the cost of living, the cost of infrastructure. Everything has gone up for people. And that has resulted in many of the goals sliding many more people into poverty. As we have been through the last few days, we're seeing most recently the financial markets in the US and Europe under a lot of pressure. And there's barely a week without a new environmental disaster. Yesterday, we saw what 1 in 1,000 years of rainfall could cost in a country that is very much able to deal with it, but reeling from the impact, and that's in Florida. And it is showcasing the devastating impact now that climate emergency has on people. And when we say planet, everyone is affected. It knows no borders. So these challenges have led to greater uncertainty and risks. And the UN will release report on the status of the SDGs later in April. I won't be spoiling any of the findings when I say that the SDGs, just as a 1.5 degree, need a lifeline. With an annual funding gap of over 4 trillion for the SDGs, we know that public funds alone will not be sufficient and will need to provide a massive boost from the private investment in developing countries. Our MDBs, multilateral development banks, and development finance institutions will be at the core of this agenda, just as they were designed so many years ago to respond to. In the SDG stimulus that the Secretary General has put forward, 3 concrete actions to accelerate progress on the SDGs: tackling the high cost of debt and rising risks of debt distresses in over 52 countries currently, massively scaling up affordable long-term financing for development, which is what it needs, and expanding the contingency financing in countries that are in need. By doing so, multilateral development banks can increase the amount of private sector financing that we could mobilize. First, in leveraging their capital bases and balance sheets more efficiently. We heard a lot about that yesterday. MDBs can make a massive contribution to expanding concessional lending to developing countries. They could also crowd in private sector by shifting to a model where loans are sold to investors. The capital adequacy framework review by the G20 provides clear steps on how this can be achieved, and it could enhance MDB investment capacity by up to $1 trillion a year. Second, the MDB's ability, to mobilize private capital at scale, emerging in frontier markets, well beyond the 34 billion that was mobilized between 2018 and 2020. I think it is very important to note that we are now in ODA at 2016 levels. That's for the poorest countries. It also includes seeing that IDA in itself is going out to leverage more than actually the public funding is coming in. These are all areas of great concern for developing countries. There is another area that relates to the use of blended finance. Blended finance mobilized only 10.7 billion per year on average, far below the contribution needed towards closing the investment gap for the SDGs. So the MDBs and the private sector need to work together, develop more effective instruments that can fully realize the potential of blended finance. Third, multilateral development banks possess a wealth of in-country knowledge and expertise, and this can be leveraged to develop strong project pipelines. We're often told that the pipelines are not there, but we do have the expertise and the partnerships to bring them together. The current cost of developing projects is prohibitive for many developing countries who also lack that technical capacity. So increasing resources that allocate to project pipeline development would be helpful. Realizing the full potential of IMDBs as catalysts of private investment is going to require deeper collaboration between the MDBs, their shareholders, and the private sector, and many of you in the room. So I'd like to thank the GISD for their work in providing a private sector perspective on how to scale up investments for sustainable development. And as the World Bank enters a critical stage under the new leadership, I'd encourage us to build on today's discussion to bring in to the ambition on the evolution roadmap, the role of the private sector in that partnership. We don't have any time to waste. We often spend a lot of time speaking about what we can't do. We need to bring to New York and the GA what we can do. We have promises that we've made 7 years ago, billions of people, and we have to meet those promises. We will be worse off if we don't. We need a world that is more united and not becoming fractured in the way it has. To talk about scarce resources today flies in the face of what has been available to the Silicon Valley Bank, to Credit Suisse, to many amounts of money that have come out in the billions over the last few months. So I think this is a time for a reality check. We have the resources, we have the wherewithal, we've got leaders, but are they ready to step up to the challenge of making this a much more peaceful and prosperous world for all? Thank you.
Deputy Secretary General, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I'm really pleased to welcome you to this event co-organized by the World Bank, Global Investors for Sustainable Development, UN Department for Economic and Social Affairs, and CEDA. We live in a world marked by Russia's aggression on and brutal war in Ukraine, by climate change and a global cost of living crisis. The financing gap to reach the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris climate goals is enormous. At the same time, expectations are high. There is also a sense of urgency. As someone has put it, there is no planet B. Business as usual is simply off the table. 52 years after the UN member states agreed on a 0.7% GDP target for development aid, only 5 countries of the developed countries honor this commitment. Sweden is one of these 5 countries. And while we call for other countries to step up, we at the same time understand that international development aid money alone will not fix this. Development aid well spent can only be a small part of a country's path out of poverty, of unleashing people's ability to fulfill their potential and to save our planet. For countries to move out of poverty, they need rule of law, investments and structural reforms, which foster private businesses, economic growth and trade. As in our own experience, trade and development mutually reinforce one another. My government is giving increased focus in our development work on private sector development, job creation, and in participation in international trade. With this aim at heart, the Swedish government views the multilateral development banks as key partners going forward. With the bank's help, we can leverage our development funding and bring in needed capital, private capital to work to induce sustainable economic growth and trade, to tackle the climate challenge and to support the necessary green transition. Private and institutional assets of pensions funds, mutual funds and insurance companies have grown fast the last decades. They now exceed the combined balance sheets of the multilateral development banks by several hundred times. What we aim for is a stronger and truly visionary partnership between the public and the private spheres. Aid, as it best, first and foremost, catalyzes other financial flows, many times larger its size. I do think we have good reasons to be optimistic. I'm encouraged to see such an engagement, interest, and leadership from many investor-led initiatives represented here today. The commitment of the global investors for sustainable development and investors such as CDPQ and Nordea is very welcome. As I said, multilateral development banks are key partners. Investors are coming to the MDBs, and in particular to the World Bank, with a wish to co-invest. But we still have challenges when it comes to level of private capital in low and middle income countries that the MDBs help mobilize. Because of this, the World Bank, GISD in Sweden and other actors tried together to identify possibilities and challenges with regards to private capital mobilization and enabling. Now it is the time to take these concrete ideas and suggestions into real action and new investment opportunities. The GISD position paper, for example, recommends that MDBs need to amend their governments and business models to increase private finance and to increase private finance mobilization and financial additionality. The ongoing World Bank evolution process must deliver on this point. The World Bank should also focus on development investable products such as sustainable and green bonds that will mobilize private finance at scale. Ladies and gentlemen, partnerships must be the name of the game. Partnership between countries, the UN, investors, and the MDBs is the way forward to put capital to work for a wealthier and healthier world. I hope the discussion today can and will inspire us. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed for that rousing call to arms. Perhaps panelists can come up to the stage while I chat quickly. Grab this. No, I don't like standing behind podiums, to be honest, but anyway. I should say, my name is Gillian Tett. I'm with the Financial Times. I chair the editorial board there. But the reason I'm here is because I founded something or co-founded something called Moral Money about 4 years ago, which looks at sustainable development issues and ESG issues and climate finance. I was actually in New York last night and got on a plane at the crack of dawn because I believe passionately that what we're talking about today is really important. It's very clear that we face a climate crisis. We now also face, if not a financial crisis, then a nasty financial situation, and emerging markets face, many of them, an economic crisis and default crisis. It's truly a horrific perfect storm. And we desperately need money to flow to the emerging markets. Very little of it currently is to the places it's currently needed. If any of you don't yet subscribe to Moral Money, which is the newsletter, you may have missed the fact that there have been some appalling numbers tossed around the World Economic Forum in recent days. A mere 3 billion, according to one of our pieces, have actually gone to sub-Saharan Africa for climate finance, even though people like to talk about $43 billion, only 3 billion has actually been dispersed. And it's unlikely to get any better at the moment, given the budget constraints on governments, unless we can do exactly what we've been hearing about, namely unlock partnerships, public-private. It hasn't happened. 10 billion of blended finance a year is absolutely pathetic, given the scale of need. Now, the story that's leading Moral Money newsletter this morning is a scoop that we had yesterday from John Kerry, who's launching his own blended finance initiative. You can read about it on the FT. It aims to take $15 million of US State Department money, get the IFIs and DFIs in on a mezzanine structure, and end up with about $1 billion. They hope to act as a template to kick everyone else into action. Very interesting project. We can maybe talk about later whether it'll work or not. It's very squarely aimed at groups like the World Bank, which they would regard as having been very slow to move on this area. But other projects bubbling. I'm told that the Emiratis may well produce their own in COP28, given that if they can spend $200 billion on kicking around a football, they have plenty of money to spend on a blended finance project and doing catalytic capital. By the way, that wasn't my quote. It was a quote coming from someone who's working very closely with them. So a lot happening, but the question really is, what are the MDBs going to do about this? So good moment to start with you, Axel. Very briefly to introduce you, I think everyone knows who people on the thing are. We have Axel von Trotzenberg, who's a senior managing director of the World Bank, been there for a long time, a huge wealth of experience and knowledge and wisdom. I think you've been under 7 presidents, haven't you, from we were talking the other day. So a lot to offer about what can and can't be done. Next to him, we have Marc-André Plongeard, who is the head of CBTQ, a very innovative group in Canada, which is backing a lot of interesting projects and ideas. We have Niels Bomstrand, who's from Nordea, from Sweden, which represents the Swedish Investors for Sustainable Development Group. And we have Corinne Jamtin, who's the Director General of the Swedish International Development Cooperation Agency. So great mix of perspectives. But I'd like to start with you, first of all, Axel. Lots of criticism in this town of the World Bank and its failure to act on blended finance. Would you accept that? And what can you do to help boost collaboration and cooperation of the sort we're talking about today? Oh, and you have to press this magic button. There you go.
Good morning, everybody. As long as the World Bank has existed, we have been subject to criticism. I think that is good. We are always open for discussion, but I'm also open for a robust debate whether certain things are correct or not. I think what is correct is that we have all to do vastly more, and that is a problem and then we need to mobilize the private sector. But let's also keep in mind that we have talked for a long time about this. And one of the issues is when you are looking at private sector flows is that right now about 40% is going to China. And that is where people are actually less concerned about. But where people are concerned about is the poorest countries. And there in the IDA countries, barely 5%. And in the sub-Saharan African country, it's like 4.5% of the flows. So we have also to see where are we wanting to concentrate on And that is one of the issues. I think actually on the mobilization, I'm talking, you need to look at an ecosystem, what you're mobilizing and what you're not mobilizing. In the ecosystem, that, for example, we are, of course, mobilizing a lot of money from institutional investor for our bonds. And just say it, that is always clear for IBRD. But now for IDA, keep that in mind. In IDA, right now, the private sector puts more money into the fund for the poorest than the donors. Let me remind you that there are more institutional investors buying IDA bonds than that donors are willing to give to IDA. So that is one of the things where we need to keep how the logic is on this. And clearly, we will need more money or concessional money. But also in the IDA case, what is happening is that donors keep their contributions flat. And so we need to keep those realities here. The reality is that people say, well, you got 93 billion, and people think this is our donor money. No, absolutely not. It is basically 23.5 billion, and that has been flat since IDA 15. So all the thing in IDA 15, we mobilized the replenishment of 42 billion with the same amount. So what we have done is we have captured money from capital markets. So that is where I think actually we don't do bad. Where it's more difficult is the investment, what we call private capital mobilization. Now, in total, the World Bank Group has done in the last 5 years about $140 billion, mainly from the IFC. So the question here is, how well can we do as a World Bank? I agree here, we can do better, but it's difficult. However, the second thing, which is not measured and maybe more important, is what I call the private capital enabling. That is the policy reform to create a better regulatory framework or incentive framework for private investment. And there you mobilize potentially a lot more capital than that you come with a small project. What we have to do is what is the famous discussion about de-risking is, and that is costing money, is that the question is how much money is there available for. And we have been providing through IDA like $2.5 billion per replenishment to IFC and MIGA. And actually, I've noticed that they themselves have been challenged to find all the projects on this. So particularly when you insist that you don't invest in the easy places, but in, for example, fragile places, and it's more difficult. I think we need to push this further, but I think it may also need to become with more de-risking devices, not only from the World Bank, but from all the other multilateral development banks, and maybe also from the bilateral side, so that you can get a pot of money where you can start showing that you can do it. Final thing is, when you want to invest in the low-income countries, you cannot expect returns of 20%. I think we have to have more modest returns, but if private investors want to insist on that, then we have a problem.
Thank you very much indeed for that strongly expressed set of ideas. And you raise a very good point about donors. You also make a very good point of how appalling it is that there has been so little donor money. And you also make a good point about the fact it's really a lot about de-risking and finding different mechanisms. Blended finance may not be the only one to actually go down that path with. Again, one of the interesting things raised by the John Kerry initiative is a question of, if you are looking at de-risking, are the DFIs, are the IFIs ready to assume, or the MDBs, a junior role in any capital tranche or structure? You know, I mean, Kerry is suggesting they assume a mezzanine role. He's not yet daring to suggest they become the first loss tranche. But, you know, that's going to require quite a shift in action. But Colin, I'd like to bring you in. What, in your view, coming from one of the few countries that has actually hit the pledge on ODA, so we can't blame you for the donor issue. What, in your view, is the key to unlocking blended finance and making it actually work, or other forms of de-risking, to pick up on Axel's point?
Thank you. And thank you for everyone for being here, the panelists and all of you in the audience. As was mentioned before, we've been working with this for a while. Starting the Swedish Investors for Sustainable Development was formed 2016, and then we worked together with UNDESA and the United Nations to form the Global Investors for Sustainable Development, or UFORM, but we inspired, I think, the Global Investors for Sustainable Development. But I would also like to start off by thanking Axel, actually, for excellent cooperation. We've been having discussions, talks, not always agreeing, but at least pushing each other in different directions, and that's how it should work. What we are trying to look at is, of course, how to find, we have since long realized that the ODA money will never be enough. We will never reach the Sustainable Development Goals simply with ODA. We work with the guarantee instrument, we work with private sector development, we work with different kinds of challenge funds, etc., etc. But to reach the big money, to disperse or to invest, have big investments in IDA countries and in the poorest countries, we hear and we see the need for the MDBs to be more present. And for the MDBs to be more present, the World Bank is of course key in itself, but also as a starting point for other MDBs to follow later on. Therefore, we have been working together in trying to find models. And we have also discussed different packages together with our Swedish Investors for Sustainable Development, what your needs are, and I suppose that Nils, you will get to that. But it's very clear when we talk to the Swedish investors that they prefer to work together with the MDBs when finding investment objectives. Otherwise, the economies in the countries that are IDA countries are simply too small to be interested. But I would also like to emphasize that we have also really realized that one important part for us as a bilateral agency, together with the bank and others, is to work on the investment environment, the business environment, by capacity building, by combating corruption, working with increased transparency, supporting financial institutions in the countries as such, or business environment. And that's not a very costly thing to do for a bilateral agency, but extremely important. So we try to use all of our tools and lobby towards the end. Thank you.
Right, well, Axel, you're very popular. Everyone wants to work with you. So there we go. Marc-André, what are your views in terms of what the investment community wants to make this work?
Well, actually, thanks to the GISD and forums like this, we've been able to articulate. I think it's pretty clear what the institutional investors, I'll talk for institutional investors because I'm now with one of Canada's the second largest pension fund in Canada. And what has been enunciated is clearly we need better de-risking instruments that are at scale and easier to use and more easily accessible and timely. We need we need to deal also the issue of the currency risk is very real. The reputational risk, and that's a big risk for boards in our institution. I don't know how we're going to tackle this, but that's a very huge, and that's why partnership, what was mentioned before about partnership by the secretary and by Amina and Axel, is that probably there's a key there. So we need better de-risking instruments. We need the pipeline of projects. So we need, everybody, Amina has been referring, the DSG has been referring to this, that, the cost of developing projects very high for the countries. We need project preparation as well that is accessible. The GIF at the World Bank is for the World Bank and for the MDBs. We have no window for institutional investors like us. And when I talk about project preparation, people talk about, is it the technical stuff that needs to happen in the countries and stuff? Yes, it's that. But more importantly, at the outset, is the upstream. It's like we need a bunch of investment bankers at the I have a very concrete solution to make. Like, let's ask the 20 largest bank in the world to lend 10 people tomorrow. Let's get a few donors around it, and let's get some institutional players like us around, and make we need people who can put partnerships together and know where the things are, know the buffet of things, because we don't know in institutional investors. We don't have the resources to do that. Don't forget, like, and we own a large part of the investable money in the world. So we need to be able to fit better in this. So pool of de-risking instrument, project preparation, and then access to the database, like the GEMS database and that sort of things. To actually, one of the problems we have institutional investors is we cannot assess the risk right. Because we don't know the situation. And so those are and because of through the GISD, that has been made clear through also with the ILN and SMI. And it's interesting, yesterday I'm co-chair of ILN, the Investors Leadership Network, a group of, with Nordea as a member and many 12 institutional investors with a lot of, obviously, capital. There was a little survey, almost unanimously, all of our members, out of the 12 institutional investors that are there, they said they want to invest more in emerging market in coming years. But the problem is, how are we going to make this? And that's the good thing is, I think we know what needs to be done, but the environment to do it is, let's not, I'll talk about this later, but let's not forget that the environment we're in is incredibly tough.
Yeah, if only this had happened 5 years ago when the world was awash with oodles of cash looking for somewhere to go. I mean, that is a terrible, terrible tragedy and the shocking wasting opportunity of what's happening right now. But just to summarize, I mean, basically you're saying you need de-risking, someone else to take the last tranche. You need currency risk protection. You need data, which the World Bank has, but not everyone else has. You'd like to have the equivalent of a structuring committee to basically organize the whole thing. And I mean, I think those are your 4 key points about how you wanted to come together. Nils, I'll ask you in a moment if you have much confidence about whether this is actually going to materialize or not. But Nils, would you agree?
Yes, very much so. And also on the reputational side and the reputational risk, which I think is quite significant for the institutions. But I'd like to start with that. What is private capital? Because we talk about it as institutional investors, and we talk about it as a little bit of the faceless capital. Private capital is postponed consumption. It's postponed consumptions by people like ourselves, by civil servants, by engineers, by plumbers, electricians, who say that, okay, I will not consume it today, but I need it at a later stage to pay my utility bills, to pay rent, hopefully when I retire, to buy a Christmas present for my grandchildren, which means that when they give this to us, it's serious. There is a responsibility on our behalf to give that money back and give them a return. And that part is what makes this very difficult, because the other side of this is also that we are horrible at the bespoke. We are really good at the standardized and at the scale side, which in my view is that we need to stop producing craft beer and we need to start producing Carlsberg beer. It needs to smell the same, it needs to have the same flavor, and most importantly, it needs to come in the same tin every time so we can understand it and that we can deploy significant amount of money towards it. Because as long as it's bespoke, it means that we need one decision for each investment that we make. And it also means that it gets very, very hard to create liquidity, because we're not the same, the institutional side. So the asset owners, the pension funds, they have money, you could even say, for perpetuity. Whilst the asset management industry that I represent, our clients have promised us the money all the way until tomorrow. Tomorrow they can come and say, we want our money back. And that means that we also need a liquidity around this. And without standardizing it, without creating at scale, there will be no liquidity, and it will be very hard for us in investing into it. And the entire legislation around us is also defined on this liquidity, because that's a protection of the end investor in this.
Right. So basically what you're saying, you need something equivalent to Fannie Mae in the US, which has provided standardization liquidity for the housing market. You need something like that for climate finance in emerging markets. You've touched on this already, but I'd like to both ask you. Microphone. Yeah. Everyone wants to hear your pearls of wisdom.
No,
so.
but no, it's your wisdom, Gillian. I actually think that the way you phrase it, that's not far from what I was talking about the upstream project preparation. It's the same kind of thing. It's actually putting transactions together, making them actually bankable for us. And that's the kind of things that we're talking about.
Yeah, well, Fannie Mae works by having a very heterogeneous housing market across the US and pooling it and creating liquidity and standardization. Can't say the history of Fannie Mae is necessarily an inspiring example of how to organize yourself, but hey, you can learn from the mistakes of the past. But yeah, but I'd like to ask you both, Marc-André and Niels, what do you actually, what are the GISD recommendations on this? I mean, we've touched on this, but what exactly, do you have a hit list of what you'd like to see? Aside from what I mentioned earlier, the 4 points.
Those are the main points. I would say, so let's try to make sure that we adapt them to the reality of the current market. Like, just think about that in a moment. Yesterday, I was at hearing Prime Minister Motley and the DSG, and Prime Minister Motley was saying, well, I used to, a year ago, was borrowing money from the World Bank and others, the multilateral development banks at 1%. I'm now paying 5%. So it shows most countries in the world, and that could cause the debt trap that we talk about and all that. I said, Prime Minister, the flip side of it, sad flip side of it, is a year ago I was lending money at 1%, and now I'm lending money at 5%. So that means that, of course, there's the inflation, and we take that into account and all of that. But just think about what is going in the mind of investors in reality, in institutional investors. And so we need, so the South will want the cost of money to be cheaper. And Axel, to answer your question, that it's always the same, or is it you or someone? I'm used to have you ask it that question. Are we willing to take less return for doing good? That is a question that will not.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, I would love to have a different answer, but we have a problem on this one.
Right. I'm going to go to Niels first and then you, Axel.
So just to conclude on that, we all want to be part of the solution, but we all have fiduciary obligations that were. So my point is, adapting the pool of first risk that I was mentioning for the current situation, it's clear to me that donors need to come together and partners need to come together, and the MDBs and us, to think about how are we going to make sure that the cost of borrowing is bearable for the South, while we can invest there. So there's a gap that is missing, and that's how you need to leverage public money.
Right. I want Axel to come to that in just a second, but first, Niels, do you think we've missed the moment in terms of the interest rate cycle? Because I mean. Yeah. Me and Motley can at least borrow at 5%. Many countries can't. And the question is, given that you have investors in the West now thinking they can get much higher returns elsewhere, they may no longer be interested in all this stuff anyway. I mean, go to them with senior debt from, John Kerry's structure, and they might say, why bother?
First of all, I think the reason we're here is that we sit on the mandate of our clients, and the mandate of our clients do actually today include sustainability. There has been a big shift in the industry and amongst our clients, our savers, that yes, they need their money back. Yes, they need return, but they're also telling us we want to be part of the solution. So then I think it's up to us to actually look at, okay, what does that solution look like? And private capital thrives on predictability. That means that it thrives in a world where we have rule of law, where you have matured institutions, and many of the places that we need to finance things now don't have matured institutions. And I think this is the intersection between the public and the private. How do we take away that lack of predictability that we need on the private side? And how do we make sure that we work together to do that at scale?
Right. Well, Axel, I'd love you to comment on that. You've had questions thrown at you quite a lot. And also, I'm also aware the World Bank has recently been announcing initiatives to try and develop more private capital flows. So tell us a bit about that as well.
Well, I mean that, the good and the bad news of what Niels is saying is it's very good news for China, very predictable, and it's big, it's scale. It may be even also good news for Vietnam. It may be good news for Malaysia. But what you're saying is devastating for Africa because you will not put a penny in there. That's the reality. And so we have also to focus the discussion about what we are talking. Are we now looking how you can increase your investment in China? I don't think that is the problem. Is it the problem actually even in Vietnam? Vietnam, they are fine. They are doing it. And I actually was even in countries like Bangladesh, they are getting a lot of the foreign direct investment. So what we usually are looking at is we have a little bit of the link into the discussion because we put all these developing countries together and one part is thinking, how can the private sector complement these efforts in poorer countries, while you're thinking, well, I'm looking at a very specific set of countries that are actually not the problem. And I think that is where we need to discuss what is actually then available, because when you say it needs predictability, it needs certainty, I can tell you that in many of the IDA countries is not the case. And so that is why you are seeing maybe also the logical decision that there are very little investments are going. And that is why, I mean, I was not arguing that you have to have a lower return in China or in Vietnam. But the question is, indeed, in some of the African countries you need. And when you talk about sustainability, there is the question that basically Africa is a huge challenge. And ultimately, if that is not being addressed, there will be more instability elsewhere as well. So I think if the public sectors cannot all respond to it, then we need to see what kind of coalition it is. Now, what we didn't say in all the discussions is what the governments or what the countries themselves can do to facilitate this. And my sense is, and I've been telling that in the Africa region, I think that it's very difficult for you to say, well, we'll do an investment in energy in Sierra Leone because all these different frameworks is very fragmented. So often I've said, can we actually think of much bigger regional, sub-regional projects like West African Power Pool, where you then say, can we have a 10 or $15 billion program, investment program, where IDA would put 5 billion, other IFC and other, and then you mobilize additional money. I think that's interesting. Same with the digitalization. I've been asking, can we actually think much bigger so that basically we don't need to deal with all sorts of fragmented frameworks, which make your decision-making very difficult. And then if you were to put a bigger pool, and in which you then actually put then a very significant amount of IDA money, that it helps also in the government context that we have, that you give more assurance, in the framework, but also when the investments is that one has more certainty that, against expropriation and other events.
I can see that everyone's clutching their microphones. They're so keen to jump back in, Axel. So you sparked some great reactions. I'm going to turn to Colin in a moment. But first of all, yeah, Niels and
So first of all, we don't need certainty. We can live with unpredictability. The issue is that we charge for it. And that's the part that doesn't work. So that's also why I was trying to make the point that we need scalability. We need we need a pipeline and continuous projects. And we need the data to understand, okay, what risks are we actually taking here? And then we also need help to delever that risk. And if we can get that, and if we can get that in instruments that we are used to dealing with, and that there are several of us, that we're not solving it one-to-one, but we have many of us, that will also create the liquidity at the back end. That was the point I was trying to make.
Well, that seems a great moment to bring Colin in because, you know, I'm really curious to hear from you. I mean, you have been involved already in guarantee programs via the IFC on quite a big scale. Do you think that guarantees are the way to de-risk things and bring private sector in? And I mean, and if just, I mean, I keep mentioning the Kerry project just because it is tangible and coming down the tracks and out there. One of the things they are trying to do is get groups like you to take a mezzanine layer or even a first loss layer in the tranche. Would anyone do that? Because that's been something of a stumbling block for a lot of IFIs and DFIs until now.
Thank you for interesting questions, but I would like to answer this from another angle, and that is that we sit here, we have different perspectives. We work with different kinds of mandates, and we very rarely meet with several bilateral donors together with the private sector arms or different arms of the World Bank and other MDBs together with investors. We should try to elaborate along the lines that Axel spoke and try to find the new models going forward. We did do some small efforts or some biggish efforts some years ago. The MCPP, I think that you were alluding to, but then we have to find the new MCPPs. And the only way to do that is to sit in the same room and work in a lab-like way. We are several donors who nowadays work with different kinds of guarantee instruments. The strength of ours is that it's if it's called upon, then it's called against the Swedish state budget, meaning it has a AAA rating. Others are function in other ways. But we do work together with other bilateral donors who have also have guarantee instruments, together with the USAID, trying to put our guarantee instruments alongside each other, together with European Union and also others. I don't think that guarantees are the solution. It's one of the solutions that could be used, but we have to really find other kinds of solutions and work together. And thus, I would like to also add in this intervention that I feel actually it's a defining moment, and I'm, despite all of the challenges, quite optimistic. Having met several of Axel's colleagues at the bank over the week, but also others, the discussions around the evolving bank, the new president, and everything that is now sort of stirring the inside of the bank feels positive. And we can really grab this moment and continue the discussion and be concrete. We did have some concrete discussions some years ago with colleagues in the bank. My impression was that several of the Swedish investors felt positive around it, but they were negatively surprised because it didn't materialize. So we're wanting for things to materialize. Sorry.
So it's wonderful. I mean, it brings to another great question, which is, can you hear me? Is this working? I have to push again. Is this working now? Yeah, good. Sorry. This was designed for a Norwegian height-wise, not for me. So apologies if it's not very clear. Exactly. Yeah. Or Swedish. Yeah. It certainly wasn't designed for a short English woman anyway. But if you each had, we are about to have a new president of the World Bank. You know, it looks like we know who it's going to be, but moving aside from the specifics of names, if you had one wish that you'd like to put on his or her in tray coming in, what would it be? Maybe I can start with you, Colin. Sounds like you want to basically have one gigantic sort of offsite / hackathon for the key partisans, lock them up in a room like they do in Silicon Valley and tell them, feed them pizza for 48 hours and tell them they can't come out till they've sorted it out.
Exactly. Good idea. You've given the answer. Thank you. Yeah, but along those lines, continue work with the Global Investment for Sustainable Development, realize the PCM discussions that is currently going on, and then don't be strained by old ideas. Find the new ones and the way forward. That's the only way forward. I would like to add one thing, and that is It's finding new kinds of financing methods or financing for climate, of course. But I would like to stress for the whole SDG agenda, which are many other things than climate action.
Absolutely. Nils, do you have any, top wish for the new World Bank president?
To me, it's about the openness. We're here now. We're willing. We want to be part of the solution. I sense the same thing when I talk to American institutions, as I feel when I talk to European institutions, as I feel when I talk to Asian institutions. We want to be part of the solution. We need to be let in. If we're going to be successful, it needs to be about scalability and deploying this at scale, and thereby also de-risk.
Right. Marc-André, and by the way, I'm going to turn to the audience for questions in just a few moments. So start thinking of your points or questions you'd like to add into the conversation in just a few moments.
I have nothing to add to what Karen and Neil said on the, I totally agree, and I will just build on that. Like Karen's idea of a lab, it just shows you like, it's new for us. Let's for the institution. It's the World Bank has been there for what, 75 years now, and no, but like a long time. Oh, but for us, we've been in emerging markets for 8 years. Okay. So this is a new thing, and the entire ecosystem needs to understand that we're new, and that we need to learn, and that actually, because to understand the risk and price it accordingly and all of that. The other thing is, there's a role for, we're all different, and our capital there's a different role for each of our capital here. It sounds basic, but let's never forget that. There are things the World Bank and other multilateral institutions will do that an institution like mine will never be able to do. But let's just be more complementary and accept that we're not competing with each other. We're just trying to, because we want all to be part of the solution. I will give you an example of where I was thinking about, maybe for Africa. I like your ideas of the big projects. I think there's something to think about there. On the other hand, also, if we go smaller, maybe our role is more in private equity in Africa than it is in infrastructure, where sometimes issues of corruption are more present, and for reputational risk. I'm starting to evolve in my thinking that actually our role across the world for an institution like mine will be different, and we'll invest in different asset classes everywhere, and thinking differently. And I want to make one final point for me. I actually believe I think my CV demonstrates it. I am a big fan of multilateral institutions. So I'm a big fan of the World Bank Group and the MDBs and the UN. The only thing now with what we have as an undercurrent everywhere in the world, in the Western world in particular, with populism and everything. Canada, for example, I'll give you, for 93% of our climate money given by the government of Canada was invested through multilateral organizations. France is at 60%, and they invested 40% directly. I think in countries like Canada, if we want to have the social license to actually invest and contribute to the world, unfortunately, the nationalism is coming into the way here. And DFIs, my antidote to this is not to reduce what we're doing in the world, but to enhance it, but actually put FinDev Canada and instruments like and DFIs like those on steroids, because they're going to come very easily on mezzanine role, like the Kerry example. I actually believe that there's a lot of future in what Secretary Kerry is proposing, and I think it's a good model. But that's a model that will allow us to go. It's easier to deal with for us in some instances with our DFIs, because they know us, we know them. The level of trust is very high. It's faster. So for things we will be, but that doesn't mean we need to work with the World Bank Group. way more than we do at the moment.
Right, well-
It's not one or the other, it's both enhanced.
I'd say if cuddly, sober Canada is getting worried about multilateralism, heaven help us. Because, you know.
No, but it's a reality. We have a party now, but let's not, we have a party in a position that is challenging Prime Minister Trudeau, which last time they ran on a platform of reducing 25% foreign aid, foreign assistance. And I think they're going to run on 50% reduction the next time.
Wow.
So, and nobody in the population is saying anything. That's not an issue.
Wow.
Like it doesn't raise passion in the population.
Well, someone has written lots of columns saying, you know, thank heavens Canada is sane when it comes to policy making. That is alarming. But I'm just, before I turn to Axel and ask him for his big wish list about the World Bank president, what you'd like to ask the World Bank president to do, I'll give you time to think about that. Just quickly, Taryn, I'd like to ask you a question practically. If your top desire is to have, you know, this gigantic quasi hackathon to bang heads together, which sounds thoroughly sensible to me, who do you think should organize that? Should it be the World Bank? Should it be the United Nations? Should it be those nice, friendly Wall Street bankers? Or some nice, you know, sort of quasi-neutral Canadian bankers? You know, who should actually organize this hackathon?
My dream would be for it to be World Bank and UN together, GISD and somewhere, or World Bank and UN together. We are all parts of those two institutions. And then, if needed, you can judge that. Investors could be sort of advising on the format, but then be part, of course, on equal terms in the hackathon as such, but organized by the world, and that is UN and the World Bank.
Right. Well, in the new climate austerity, I'm sure you won't be doing what investment bankers do and go straight to Boca Raton and have, you know, a nice sort of, you know, offsite, but it really will be pizza. But sorry, you
Say one thing that I think Karen is totally right. There's a big role for GISD in this because, like, when I was appointed ambassador of Canada to the UN in 2016, I mean, I remember my first discussion with Ban Ki-moon at the time, and he said to me, not exactly in those words, but we cannot talk about the private sector in this place. Like that was like not so long ago. And now the private sector is coming to the UN more and more. And like, just think about before Glasgow at COP, the presence of the private sector was very minimal. We're starting. And so we need an organization like GISD to work with the World Bank Group and others to actually open the doors and the windows of the multilateral system. It's, of course, it's an intergovernmental structure, but it's so necessary to solve the issues that we're facing to bring the private sector. Like the president of the Bank of America, I remember at Glasgow, I had to wait 2 hours to get in, like because he was like, I'm not saying that he should have a special status, but it's kind of weird that actually the private big corporations, like he represents an entity that is bigger than many states in the world. And so my point is, the system is ill adapted for all of these contribution and collaboration. And so we need to multiply the occasions where we take people together and we open the door of multilateral institutions to bring them in and be part of the discussion. The problem is, will the private sector have the patience? That's another issue.
Right. Corinne, quickly, and then Axel. Axel's every moment, Axel, you get more time to think and craft your brilliant response.
I would just like to add that Addis Ababa Action Agenda has not really been mentioned, but that's the financing sort of mirror of the SDG and the Agenda 2030. More or less all governments on the globe have signed up to the Addis Ababa Action Agenda. And in that, private sector, institutional investors, etc., everything that we're talking about here is in the Addis Ababa Action Agenda. So if we want to keep all of the governments accountable, then we must use that agenda. So that could also be a part of it. So that's what I wanted to add.
Right.
Thank you.
Well, Axel, before we go to questions, I wanted to give you a chance to respond because you've had lots of ideas put out there, and I'd love to know whether you think doing a gigantic pizza-filled hackathon would be the answer.
Totally. But look, I still want to come back. For what do we want to have the private sector in an increased way in it? Now, if I look at Asia, it is not to build a Coca-Cola plant in but it is climate. And it is here about the coal exit. And just to give you that sense, for the coal exit, only in Asia, you will need up to $13 trillion over the next 20 years. And you would need to actually literally close every single day a coal-fired plants. That's not happening because there are 400 new plants coming up stream in the next couple of years. I think that's the problem. And that's one of the things is how can we engage the countries and then also with the private sector. I'm not so much thinking about China, but I'm thinking about India, Indonesia, Vietnam. And that engagement is a tricky one. Now that is where the biggest bang is, because at the end of the day, we want also there's an expansion for something. And in Asia, it is coal exit in my mind, because it is directly linked to the whole challenge of keeping the things to 1.5 degrees. In Africa, it is much more broader, because in Africa, only half of the population has access to energy. So there are far more basic things to do. And there we need to think how we can do this. So,
I think we might.
okay, is it now working?
Yeah.
And so that is still an issue where we need to know. And the final thing about leveraging, I think we should stop this nonsense among bilaterals and multilaterals that everybody is leveraging each other. I think we need to go back to a basic honesty. Just tell me what you are doing and not counting what the rest is doing. The amounts are staggering, and it is actually not helpful because it gives the impression that we have solved the problem when we have not solved the problem. Just say what you're doing and don't say what the rest is doing. I think this will help to a new honesty, and it also will reveal the remaining problems that have to be done. Now, on the president, I think what we need to think about is the World Bank has had three, I think, more or less transformational presidents. One was Eugene Black in the 50s. We got the IFC, we got IDA, we got actually AAA, Robert McNamara, and Wolfenson. So the thing is, when do we do well is that when we have visionary leadership and that can help transform. And so that is what I always hope for, because actually the challenges are big. I think we should be very much forward-leaning. We have the capabilities if we want, but what we also need to make sure is that our shareholders are with us. And that is what I want to remind, because what you just said was happening in Canada with populism is not only there. And what you are seeing is that many people are withdrawing. So when I often say is what's the most important message, not only for the bank, for the UN or anybody, is stay engaged with developing countries and don't withdraw. That can be on developing countries, but it's also on the climate change, where we cannot only have talk, we will need to have these trillions. And I think that is the biggest challenge. And I think it is also the big challenge for the next president.
Right. Before we just go to the audience, one tiny question that comes out of that. Do you think it's actually a mistake to be talking about blended finance? Would we be better to actually go to the shareholders and say it's time for general capital increase instead? Is that the main focus that you think we should be on, and the blended finance is a distraction?
Well, I think the blended finance concept, I agree with this, but I think we need to be honest, because there is a limited pool of resources, and we shall not take these resources away from the poorest countries. This should be an organizing principle. And my biggest concern is that basically people say, well, we take it from the weakest. This is not acceptable. Now, then you have to have that extra money for middle income countries. And I don't see that money. So you need to think differently on this. And I believe that there are ways, but for example, you could also on the coal exit, you could have MDBs providing ultra long maturities. And of course, the rates are cheaper than the rates they can get in their market. So there is a financial benefit. Of course, if you have ultra long maturity, you bind a lot more capital. So it has a discussion about the capital increase. Last word on capital increase. People, while they don't say it, they analyze all their actions through shareholding issues. So let there be no mistake about this. There are 10 arguments being used because people are looking through that angle. But we still need to deal with it. So I think I personally, people know my view about capital increase. I think you can do a lot, and it is cheap.
So you're saying you should have a capital increase, or you should?
Personally, I think that if we look at the challenges that we are facing, then I think you need to look at how capital, I'm not talking only capital increase or for the World Bank, for the MDBs, because for $1, you can lend $10 in the next couple of years. So it is an enormous amount of, with little input. Keep in mind, in the World Bank, only $21 billion was paid in 75 years. Yet we were lending $840 billion in nominal. It's about 1.6 trillion in today's values. It's almost a non-brainer what you can do with MDBs. That concept, in that sense of real leveraging, should be attractive in fiscally stressed times.
Right, we got a question already over there, and we got almost everyone wants to ask a question. Great. Over there, and then lady there.
So, hi, thanks for, I think this debate was more honest than what we heard before. So thanks for that. But one suggestion and one question, mostly for.
And by the way, it would be courteous but not compulsory to identify yourself. It's not compulsory, but just courteous.
Marcus Svedberg for folks on the Swedish insurance and pension company. So you talk about a hackathon. One concrete suggestion this week and every spring and fall week, there is another conference going on in town, a couple of blocks here, JP Morgan conference. Pretty much every single EM investor in the world is present. So why don't you just do the hackathon this week? Just ask the new president to go to speak to Joyce and do this week. Everyone is there every time.
And get JP Morgan to pay for the refreshments.
I think they will be happy to do it.
Actually, I'm sure you can't not allowed
Then
to
the
do
question,
that.
I think Mark-Andrew mentioned it, and Niels as well, the data question. The GEMS database, what is the status? It's been an ask from institutional investors for a very long time, and it seems to be like the lowest hanging fruit out there. Is it going to be made public?
Actually, why don't we take 3 questions, and you can basically then that'd be more efficient. Again, give you time to think quickly. A question over here. Lady wearing the wonderful salmon pink FT color there. And then question over there in the back. I want to get as many of you making comments. Do keep them quick so we can get as many as possible.
Hi, my name is Anulika Ajufo, and I work within impact investing, but also sit on the board of a large asset manager, HarborVest Global Private Equity. So my question is this. Marc-Andre, you made very, very insightful comments at the start about different risks that private sector face in coming into these regions. So 2 you mentioned of note are 1, reputational risk, and 2, currency risk. Now, currency risk is one that I find to be quite a behemoth in going into emerging markets and seeking to repatriate funds at some point without eroding return. What gives? What can happen in that area? What do you think is possible as we seek to address currency risk challenges?
Right. Okay.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry. So GEMS database and then currency risks separately. And then question behind over there. By the way, all great questions. Then over there.
Courtney Roberts, Moonshot Global, former MEGA and IFC staff person. Now we focus on impact and for impact investing in infrastructure. So my question is, we spoke a lot about risk, which is real, but I wonder what is the role of impact standards in the conversation, particularly to counter issues like populism and others that are on the rise. I think, you know, a lot of people wrongly, you know, view infrastructure investment as, you know, not necessarily one and the same as impact focused. So what role do impact standards play in the conversation?
So let's take those three as quickly as we can. I do want to get, I can see more hands waving, and then we'll try and get more questions. Do you want to address the GEMS database issue?
GEMS, I think I'm personally not dealing with it, but there is a lot of interest also in the G7 and in the G20. I think this is well published. I think they are working with EIB, is having that with IFC, and see where there are any issues on confidentiality, but they are going. The idea is to publish this, and I don't have the date where I could give you, but I think that is being pushed also hard by the G20 and G7. On the currency risk, I think one of the things what we need to keep in mind is their macro policies, and particularly multiple exchange rates, matter to actually because they negatively affect investment climates. So we have been engaging with government. This is not always easy on this, but it is precisely why I was saying that apart from regulatory reform, you will need to seek some stable macroeconomic environment that makes it then also more predictable, also what the exchange rate policy will be. So that is something that needs to be. We have actually on exchange rate risk in the private sector window for the poorest countries, we have one window that is covering those risks.
Right. Do you want to talk about currency risk, impact standards, either of you?
I'll just make a quick comment on the currency risk. It's about I'm not a specialist, but I can tell you what I hear the most from my gang at the CDPQ. It's about the cost of it, of the facilities that are now there, and the scale as well. So that's what you need to deal with. And you have to remember, like, just take CDPQ. We report our returns twice a year in Canadian dollar. And that's a good example of, you know, when I'm here and it's the nature of like focus more on governments, multilateral institution. You hear the Mia Motley, we hear the multilateral banks and stuff. And and the JETP is a good example. Sometimes my criticism of the JETP, I often say to Mark Carney, that's good thinking of a governor of a central bank, but like it's not exactly. We all need to come to the table with the JETP, and I'm going to work for this. But the issue is, we have to develop things more in thinking in how do investors work, and how in my shop. It works bottom up. You know, it's the investors. They develop conviction, and think about just the impact on the incentives in our world as well in investment and in finance, and how they are even to the personal employee of an investor. And this is sometimes the quid pro quo nobody wants to talk about, but we need to understand that. Like if my investors at CDPQ are rewarded based on the returns that they provide, you know, and that is annual for them, and I have to deal with that. Like just think about the impact it has, and so that's the old system, and that's why I said it's relatively new for all of us. We all need to adapt, adjust, and see what's right, what's not right, but. That's what I'm begging the system and the ecosystem to understand the reality of that.
Either you want to comment quickly on impact standards, and I want to get one more question in if we can, 1.5.
I find impact standards very important for us, also from the perspective of the reputational risk. I think this can help us, and I think it can both standardize, but also deal with some of the risks we have on the greenwashing side. And I think the other side of it is that let's not make the good the enemy of the great in this. We need to make sure that, okay, we need to set the bar in a way that we can evolve in that we're not just jumping forward. And I think this is particularly important for the developing world. We now have a full European legislation that is fully focused on Europe and saying that, okay, this is what good looks like. And yes, that's true in France, in Sweden, in
Right.
Finland. But can it look different in other parts of the world? And do we
Right.
respect that?
Well, we have almost no time left, but a question there. Okay. Let's take three very quick comments, super fast. 1, 2, 3, literally 30 seconds each.
Okay, thanks. I'm Sally Paxton. I'm from an organization called Publish What You Fund. And in January, we put out an index where we measure the transparency of 30 DFIs, multilateral, bilateral, private, public, and found that the level of disclosure is extremely low, and particularly on mobilization rates. There is very little project level information on mobilization. We're looking to the
Right.
private sector to come in and be the savior, but they have very little insight into what's being mobilized, what rates are. GEMS is one answer, but there's just a dearth of information. So my question is, would you support more transparency, particularly on mobilization, particularly at the project level?
Right. 30 seconds and then 30 seconds.
Thank you. My name is Alvira Eurlings. I'm CIO of the ILX Funds. We're based in Amsterdam, an emerging markets focused asset manager. And I would just want to make a comment on the concept of de-risking that was made in a few instances this morning. So what we are doing at ILX is we have been entrusted with 1 billion of Dutch pension fund money to the work of the MDBs. So we are working alongside and we are investing alongside the MDBs in Turkey, in Nigeria, in Egypt, in El Salvador, and Ecuador. And for the Dutch pension funds, that's the purest form of de-risking, working with the MDBs based on their experience, based on their expertise, preferred creditors treatment. So I think for us, we want to make a big plea. That's the de-risking form that the Dutch pension funds are comfortable with. They're comfortable with the returns. They're comfortable with the risk of working with the MDBs. And I think where we do call upon the MDBs is to use that scarce pot of money blending to make the pipeline bigger. We need more projects.
Well, that's fascinating. So there's more than one way to do the de-risking process. You wanted to ask a quick question as well. Is there a microphone over there? And then we must quickly allow you each to respond for about a minute max, I'm afraid. I'm sorry, I'm keeping people moving. I know we should go on for a lot longer.
Yeah, Manmohan Kumar, CDPQ, wonderful comments. So overarching question, should MDBs be judged not by the amount of funding or financing they provide directly, but the overall funding they provide, which means private capital as well as their own funding? And if it is that, what are the two major reforms which they should undertake to mobilize private funding to the maximum?
All such amazing questions. We really could go on for another hour, I think, but you've each got a minute to respond to whichever one you wish. I mean, literally a minute. Go down the road. Karen?
Just to comment to the last comment or question. Maybe, but maybe not, I was about to say, because the challenge is not if the MDBs are in such way leveraging the private capital. If it's, we have to measure how we all are leveraging private capital in different forms. So we have to find other ways.
Right.
I don't think I have, yeah.
And on transparency, I'm sure everyone agrees the answer is yes, but Niels.
I'm not sure if I have any comments to the other questions. What I would like to say, though, is that I believe that the inflection point that we're at now is, and the issues that are facing us, they are multilateral, they are global, and they are existential. And those types of issues will not be solved by private capital. Those types of issues are political issues. It will take political solutions for this. And we are here, we're willing to talk, we want to help, we want to be part of the solution. But fundamentally, the politicians need to stop abdicating and step up and say, this is the way we want the world to look in the future.
Great location to be giving that message right now. But anyway, Marc-André.
I'll just make one comment on the partnership, what you've made, the de-risking with you're bang on. And I think for us, the institutional investors now, when we go around the world, we need to think about, there are institutions, whether it's another institutional investors from a region, like let's say we are Canadian one, well, partnering with an Emirati fund, for example, when we invest somewhere in other parts of Asia, may be also a way to de-risk us. I mean, we just need to think about that. My other plea is to reform not only the World Bank, but the UN system. I really believe that the UN system doesn't take a change to the Security Council, and it's actually leveraging the assets we have in the UN system and the information, like the country teams. We're talking about the database of the MDBs, but the country teams. But it takes a shift in the people some people that are there. There's been a shift with the reform put in place by Amina Mohamed, but we need to go forward, because I actually believe, like whether you talk about IFAD or UNDP, there are things where we could go together with their help, and actually that would help us de-risk some of us, the private sector investors, and do things we wouldn't do otherwise.
Fascinating. Axel, last 30 seconds.
I think on the transparency, I think that is happening actually in the individual operations at the bank. But I think maybe one needs to provide more summary ones and then publish this. Now, on the second one, on investing alongside this is what we need to keep in mind, and that has to be discussed. It depends if you're dealing with an IFC or a World Bank, because it is about PCT. Because you mentioned PCT, I think we need to be very clear that PCT is usually not shared. And that comes to your question, that if you were to go this along, and you will say, with this, you want to extend PCT, preferred creditor status, then you have a massive problem in the architecture, international financial architecture of multilateral institutions. So I think so I think we need to be very clear about that treatment. And that is going to be important, particularly in lower income countries, as then debt restructuring may affect that discussion.
Right, well, thank you. Well, I'm not going to try and summarize what's been discussed, it's been a very, very rich, very lively discussion. Simply to say that the sheer magnitude of hands waving at me shows that we're just at the start of a meaningful, serious debate, not the end. I really do look forward to this extraordinary hackathon that's coming down the tracks. And it just remains for me to say a very, very big thank you, both to the Deputy Secretary General and the State Secretary for their contributions. Thank you to all of you for listening so intently. I saw almost none of you checking your phones as this happened. So it shows that this really is an issue which is engaging a lot of people. And thank you to the panelists for such a forthright and interesting exchange of views. And very best of luck in turning these words into action next. So thank you all.